Welcome to This Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you with us today because we're embarking on a genuinely fascinating historical journey. We're going to look at the history of Bollywood, but through a very specific structural lens. Our objective here is to uncover exactly how Bollywood's shifting financial models, specifically between 1920 and 2004, directly reshaped the moral codes, the character archetypes, and really the entire national identity portrayed on screen. Think of it as a follow-the-money approach. We're exploring the idea that in the film industry, whoever pays the bills ultimately writes the script. It's a brilliant look at how the literal mechanics of production influence the art of storytelling. Let's get into it.
So here is our roadmap. First, we'll look at the birth of cinematic nationalism. Second, the Soviet institutional era. Third, the crisis and illicit funding. And finally, underworld control and narratives.
You can think of this timeline as the structural backbone of our explainer today. We're looking at three totally distinct eras of funding that profoundly altered the character archetypes we saw on screen. We start way back in the 1920s with mythological and nationalist themes, then we transition into the 1940s with socialist and Marxist influences, and finally we arrive in the 1980s with Underworld and Hawala funding. So let's start right at the very beginning.
Part 1. The birth of cinematic nationalism.
Okay, so we're traveling all the way back to the 1920s. This was a time when early cinematic pioneers were using this brand new medium to foster national pride and really challenge British colonial rule. And to put this in perspective, according to historical records, a staggering 70%, 70% of all films released between 1920 and 1930 were actually based on Hindu epics and civilizational history. Indian cinema in this era wasn't just mindless entertainment, you know? It was a deeply rooted cultural showcase. Early filmmakers like Dada Saheb Phalke, who's often considered the absolute father of Indian cinema, and Baba Rao Painter, operated in what the source material actually describes as the peak of Hindutva cinema. They really focused on stories derived from the Mahabharata, the life of Chhatrapati Shivaji, and just traditional Indian values in general. These directors used this incredibly powerful new medium to communicate Indian civilization to the masses, essentially uniting them against British rule. In fact, pro-nationalist films like Bhakta Vidur and 1921 were literally banned by the British because their nationalist undertones were just that strong.
Moving on to Part 2, the Soviet institutional era.
Let's fast forward a bit to the post-World War II landscape. The world is split into capitalist and communist camps. Over in India, right after independence, Prime Minister Nehru's socialist ideas led to pretty close ties with the USSR, which obviously opened the doors to heavy cultural exchanges. Now, to understand how this shifted the stories we actually saw on screen, we have to look at the institutions driving it. In 1936, the Progressive Writers Association, or PWA, was formed. Driven by Marxist ideology, this organization basically viewed traditional Indian morality and religion as completely outdated. This was quickly followed by the Indian People's Theatre Association in 1943. And just impartially reporting the historical record here, these organizations acted as literal training grounds that systematically shifted mainstream movie narratives toward themes of class struggle, wealth disparity, and systemic exploitation.
The USSR was actively seeking to inject socialist themes into Indian cinema. Top Indian filmmakers and actors, we're talking absolute legends here, like Raj Kapoor, Dilip Kumar, and K. Abbas, were actually sent to the Soviet Union for training and exposure. While they were there, they were taught Soviet-style filmmaking and highly encouraged to adopt socialist perspectives. By the time we hit the late 60s and 70s, artists who aligned with these leftist views were receiving massive institutional backing from Indian government bodies, like the National Film Development Corporation and the National School of Drama.
Because of this, the core message of cinema fundamentally shifted from celebrating ancient heritage to directly critiquing modern societal structures. Let's compare two landmark films to really see this in action. On one hand, you have Dada Saheb Phalke's Raja Harishchandra from 1913, which proudly promoted Indian history and mythology. In the film, specific scenes of Harishchandra's noble sacrifices, like giving up his kingdom and his family just to uphold the truth, were designed to represent the absolute highest ideals of civilizational duty. But on the other hand, look at the 1951 film Awaara. In its famous courtroom scenes and stark depictions of city slums, the protagonist's descent into thievery is explicitly framed using a Marxist framework. The film argues that his criminality is the direct product of an oppressive, unequal environment rather than an individual moral failing.
So, during this institutional funding era, we see a complete total inversion of character archetypes. Filmmakers began integrating communist agendas where wealth and capitalism were essentially painted as inherently corrupt. Wealthy individuals, landlords, and traditional religious figures like pandits were systematically portrayed as the villains. Meanwhile, the poor were consistently depicted as the innocent victims of a deeply flawed system, which you can see clearly in films like Shree 420 and Do Bigha Zamin.
But as we know, funding models never stay static. Which leads us to a truly fascinating, kind of provocative question that pivots our timeline right into the 1980s. What happens when rising production costs meet a complete lack of bank loans?
That brings us to Part 3, Crisis and Illicit Funding.
The 1980s brought a massive, system-wide bureaucratic crisis for Bollywood. Despite its huge cultural footprint, filmmaking somehow hadn't yet been granted official industry status by the state. And this set the perfect stage for a hostile financial takeover. Let's break it down. Step 1, because there was no formal industry status. Step 2 naturally followed. Banks completely refused to provide loans, and insurance was just simply unavailable. There was literally zero transparent system for funding. Step 3, at the exact same time, production costs were absolutely skyrocketing due to large sets, massive action sequences, and fancy foreign shoots. The financial risk was immense. A single blockbuster flop could easily bankrupt a whole production company. Which brings us to Step 4. Desperate for cash, the industry left a massive vacuum, and the underworld eagerly stepped right in.
The source records note that the underworld, specifically Dawood Ibrahim's network, became the primary sugar daddy for Bollywood producers. They provided this desperately needed funding through what are called hawala routes. If you don't know, hawala is an informal, trust-based method of transferring money across borders without any physical money actually moving at all. Funneled in from places like Dubai, Karachi, and the Gulf countries, this illicit cash absolutely saved production companies from ruin. But, as you might guess, it came with a very heavy hidden price.
Part 4. Underworld Control and Narratives.
Spanning from roughly 1980 to 2004, we see how financial dependence on the underworld morphed directly into operational control on the silver screen. When financial dependence shifted to the underworld, so did operational and narrative control. Like we said earlier, whoever pays for the production gets to decide the story. The underworld used its immense financial leverage to dictate casting choices, secure lucrative distribution rights, and fundamentally alter the ideological scripts of mainstream movies. The transition was totally complete. We went from state-sponsored socialist narratives straight to industry-wide underworld financial dependency.
Now, looking completely objectively at the source data from this 1980 to 2004 period, we see a stark narrative contrast directly resulting from this hawala funding model. The records show a huge ideological shift where films increasingly featured an Islamist agenda. This included the glorification of Pakistan, sympathy or even justifications for terrorism, and Muslim characters frequently portrayed as the victims. Now, on the other side of the ledger, Hindu characters and traditions were frequently mocked. Everyday practices like puja, fasting, or the use of gomutra were heavily ridiculed, while Hindu priests and saints were often depicted as frauds, criminals, or sometimes even worse. The money completely, 100% dictated the morality shown on screen.
Conclusion: a century of shifting identities.
Over the last few minutes, we've taken a pretty wild historical journey through almost a century of cinema. And what it ultimately reveals is that cinematic national identity is rarely an accident. It is carefully engineered by its benefactors. To tie it all together, between 1920 and 1940, cultural patronage gave us mythological heroes and pro-nationalist stories to help fight colonial rule. Then, between 1940 and 1980, state and Soviet institutional funding completely flipped the script, giving us the socialist commoner as the hero and the wealthy as the villain. And finally, from 1980 to 2004, the crisis that led to hawala and underworld funding gave us narratives completely sympathetic to the underworld while actively mocking traditional cultural values. This proves an absolutely unbreakable link between where the money comes from and what the protagonist believes.
Which leaves us with this final, truly vital question to ponder. We've seen exactly how effectively funding models reshaped the moral codes of the entire 20th century. So, if shifting financial models dictate the morality we see on screen, who is financing the narrative shaping our cultural identity today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to always keep questioning the media you consume.